Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs War Room Update. We are on day number 348 of the war with Gaza, and there are still 101 hostages being held by the genocidal terrorists. The war on the ground is continuing on all the time, really. IDF forces operating to destroy the Hamas infrastructure, to eliminate the Hamas terrorists, and to ensure that both for the Israelis and for the Gazans, there is a much more secure future for us all. On Judea and Samaria, there isn't much change either. The terrorists are continuing on with their efforts. A number of terrorist attacks being carried out just in the last 48 hours. It's a constant battle there for the IDF forces to try and push back on this wave of terrorism that has been ongoing for a long time, but has really been brought to a higher gear in the last few weeks as Hamas decided to return to its policy of sending suicide bombers to Tel Aviv, as we saw just a few weeks ago, of creating car bombs that they plan to explode on civilian targets, even one that was placed on the path of a school bus in order to cause as many casualties as possible. They didn't care. In fact, they specifically targeted the children. The Houthis from the south are continuing on with air aggression, and really there's no change fundamentally from what we've seen in the last weeks and months also with them. The big stories really for today is Lebanon. Lebanon, as we saw, as many of you might have seen yesterday, there were sudden explosions of the pages of hundreds of the Hezbollah activist terrorists, and many of them eliminated. The pages blew up suspiciously. Most people are assuming that it was Israel that was behind the action. That's the reports that are coming out from the foreign press, but as yet there is no confirmation from the Israeli security establishment. The war that we're going to discuss today, though, is not the kinetic war. It's the war of diplomacy. It's the war of words. It's the war that's about to play out today in the halls of the UN General Assembly in New York. It's the war of the Palestinians to really take their intransience, their refusal to accept any type of political solution, and turn it into a diplomatic war against Israel. The UN General Assembly today will discuss another one of really an endless stream of resolutions motivated, driven, really pushed by the Palestinians, whose goal is specifically to undermine Israel, to paint Israel as an aggressor. They're using this time the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice given in July as their new method to destroy Israel. Let's just remember, this is a decision that was written by the president of the court, the president of the International Court of Justice, Justice Nawaf Salam. He is Lebanese. He actually ran for political position in Lebanon. In his period as the ambassador of Lebanon, he made untold amounts of anti-Israel comments. He's now the one who writes an advisory opinion for the entire UN. What we've seen in the UN since the 7th of October cannot be described as anything else but a disgrace. Hamas, the genocidal terrorist organization that murdered 1,200 people, butchered, tortured, raped, burned people alive, took hostages, hasn't yet been condemned by the UN. It isn't even considered by the UN to be a terrorist organization. They're just another representatives of the Palestinian people. The UN organizations are no less culpable in their actions too. On the ground, for those of you who saw the presentation that I gave in the JCFA just about a month ago, on the ground, the UN organizations that are operating in Israel at Israel's grace are part of Hamas's terror propaganda. OCHA, the Organization for the Coordination of Humanitarian Aid, bullhorns the Hamas false numbers of the death toll in Gaza. They don't care if there's obvious mistakes, even when they say 1 week, as I gave the example, 462 people were allegedly killed. Of them, 500 were women and 1,500 were children. 2,000 people killed, women and children, out of the total of 462 casualties. They don't care about their discrepancies because no one ever calls them out on that. No one ever follows systematically the reports that they provide. UNRWA, the institution of the UN that is devoted to the destruction of Israel, for perpetuating the idea that the Palestinians will eventually, that left Israel in 1948, will eventually demographically and democratically destroy Israel. It's an organization that has been entirely infiltrated by Hamas. Hamas terrorists were part of that infrastructure, employees of UNRWA. Some of them participated directly in the October 7 massacre. UNRWA is part of the problem and no part of the solution. UN Women, this should be a no-brainer. You have dozens of instances of proven rape systematically by the genocidal terrorists. The UN Women was incapable of recognizing the fact that women were raped and even uttering any type of condemnation. UNICEF, the children's organization of the UN, is also used and abused by the Palestinians and the terrorists as a weapon to attack Israel. This time it was having Israel listed on the list of countries and organizations that attack and abuse children's rights in war. It was based on OCHA's numbers, the false numbers of Hamas, about the number of Palestinian children killed. The fact that the base for their accusation is flawed, the fact that the source of that information is the same genocidal terrorist organization that carried out the October 7 massacre, doesn't bother them in any way, shape, or form. And then today we have this resolution that's going to be passed, as Abba Eben rightly quipped. If Algeria were to suggest that the world is flat and Israel flattened it, it would pass with a majority of 162 in favor and 13 abstentions. Any ridiculous resolution can pass in the UN, and that's the situation that we're facing. So today, to try and help us understand a little bit more of the workings of the UN, the intricacies of the UN, we're joined by a special guest. We're joined by Mr. Ron Nechemia. Mr. Nechemia is the chairman of the Board of Governors and president of the Global Bank Group. He has been recognized as a trailblazer in the realm of development banking and has advised multiple heads of state and is frequently called upon during the high-level and highest-level policy dialogues in the United Nations. His professional and diplomatic experience gives him great insight into the intricate interplay among the global entities such as the UN, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Nechemia, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So, Mr. Nechemia, given the introduction, what chance do you see for Israel, and based on your professional experience, what chance do you see for Israel to get a fair trial, in a fair chance even, in the UN?
So I'm holding an opinion, and that's one of the reasons that I'm on this event with you, is that things require a restart. It has been done for so long in such a way that is not beneficial for anyone, not beneficial for Israel, definitely not beneficial for the UN, and it's not beneficial for the international community. Things can get better quick. It's done in the wrong way.
This is something which we have to really get into because, as I said, the resolution that's going to be passed today undermines Israel's right to self-defense. It in no way mentions the massacre, in no way mentions the Palestinian terrorism. It undermines the peace process because it pushes even the Palestinians into Palestinian leadership into a corner where if the UN has decided that these are the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, then no type of flexibility can be shown by them. And yet the UN seems to be pushing us into that corner.
Okay, so again, let's try to break it down to pieces. It will be much easier. Okay. When we are saying the UN, and I've heard many stories in the past year about the UN, and I've heard comments, we are so unhappy, we should leave the UN. Is it really possible? Is it the UN? Is it possible to leave the UN? Is it the one speaking? Is it the UN, the one that passing resolution, for example? So in my mind, technically, I break it to pieces. So it will be much easier for people to follow on, okay? When we are saying the UN itself, we are talking about the UN, the United Nations specialized agencies, and the Secretariat, the various committees, the bodies of the UN. Can Israel exit the United Nations? No. Everything that touch international outside of the Israeli border is under the jurisdiction of the UN. If it is energy, public health, even to deliver your mail. The UN is not a single entity. The UN is more than 57 agencies dealing with development, with international development, human development, nuclear energy, and many, many, many other subjects. COVID. The UN deals with many, many issues. Can we stop being part of the dialogue? The answer is absolutely not. The second, the people that passing the resolution are not the UN. The UN does not pass any resolution. It's the member of the UN, member states of the UN, Iran, Iraq, Syria, the country, the states, their ambassadors to the UN passing the resolutions. They pass it by voting. It's not the Secretariat. The Secretariat, it's a completely different story. And let's be careful on it. The job of the Secretariat is to facilitate the dialogue. They are not the dialogue. And if they're taking the position that they are the dialogue and they are not the one that facilitate the dialogue, then we have an issue here. Because nobody asked the person from the Secretariat for his opinion. It's nice to know it, but it's not that important to me. But it is not voting. He's not a member of the committee. He's just facilitating the dialogue. And it's true all the way down. If it's misused as an instrument for any reason, it is wrong. UN employees, including a person such myself in my position, I'm required to be impartial. My own personal opinions are good for myself alone at my home. But they are not to the public. As an international public servant, I'm not representing any country. As an employee of the UN or the UN system, I'm representing the UN as a whole, the whole world, but not any individual. And when we see people acting as if they are the political process, not as if they are facilitating the political process, it means to me two things or more. One, it is the wrong corporate culture. The second is the parties to the transaction, the party to the debate, not following the rules, the UN Charter. And this is a real problem here, because everybody entitled to say whatever they want, as if they are voting member. And you cannot, Israel, perhaps, like the way you said, and the way other people saying, like Abba Evan, Israel cannot stop the voting, perhaps. But many things can be improved and corrected. And it's the improvement and the correction will benefit everybody. And that's why I'm here on this program. I don't think accusing each other, let's start, someone from the state of Israel accused the UN Secretary General for whatever comments, whatever names they want to phrase them on TV, it's facilitating diplomacy. It is not. Or otherwise, when they don't do anything that they're supposed to do because they are angry or frustrated with Israel, it's also wrong. And what we want to see is a way to mediate it, to fix it.
If we follow that thinking, Mr. Nechemia, and really we divide up between the UN as a political body represented by the different countries, and they will vote however they vote, as opposed to the personnel who make up the backbone of the UN, some of the professionals, and really the professional politicians that are there. So, for example, if you take the Secretary General Guterres, I think in Israel there was much frustration, I think to say the least, when Secretary General said that Guterres said that the October 7 massacre didn't happen in a vacuum, but happened in a context. With all due respect, is there a context for murdering 1,200 people, raping, torturing, burning people alive? I fail to understand how that type of a comment from someone in such a senior position who should be well versed in really in the art of diplomacy could have failed so horribly in his language, even if it isn't his first language, to say such a what I personally believe is a despicable comment.
Well, I kind of agree with the concept of context. We have a context for that. We ignore it, but we do have resolution on these issues, and we should follow resolutions. When September 11 happens, if you have read my article last weekend about the similarities between September 11 and October, the recent incident with Israel Hamas, the armed conflict, the UN passed a resolution with no exceptions. All nations voted to support the US and the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York. And at that event, about 2,700 people or so has been killed, murdered.
2,977.
Okay. And the UN passed a resolution to this fact. And at that day, Kofi Annan went with a statement and said that in order for us to fight terrorism as a whole, we need to have a strategy that encompasses social, political, military, and all of the options. And that's what should be adopted here because it's identical.
I actually follow quite closely many of the UN resolutions that deal with the subject of terrorism. That's my professional background, both as as a lawyer and a terror analyst. And there are a number of very, very exceptionally well-worded, strong, and important resolutions regarding the international and global fight against terrorism, but with one exception: when it comes to Palestinian terrorism against Israel. Had just to give proportions to our audience, the World Trade Center, the 9/11 attack, had it been in proportion to the massacre on October 7, wouldn't have taken the lives of 2,977 people, but would have taken the lives of over 50,000 people in one day. Thousands of them would have been raped, tortured, butchered, and yet the UN, the Secretary General, still doesn't have the ability to unequivocally condemn Hamas. Hamas isn't recognized as Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization. It isn't subject to all of the sanctions that have been imposed on Al-Qaeda, ISIS. It seems that there is a bit of a double standard being applied, or specifically a separate standard being applied for the rest of the world and Palestinian terrorism against Israel.
I agree with this statement, but this is not the UN Secretary. It's not the UN body. It is the member states that passing the resolution. The Secretary General can put any proposal on the table, does not mean that will be approved by the member states. It is a different body that voting. So the condemnation is the individual countries that making decision to vote in favor or against. a policy or to not to vote at all. But the discrimination against Israel is intolerable. I want to take example. What upsetted me the most, and again, I put it in writing, how long took the UN to express condemnation or anger or to mention the word Hamas in any context in reference to the rape that was conducted, sexual violence against women. We can agree on this immediately, that sexual violence against women unacceptable. And to me, it does not matter if she's Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, Syrian. It's irrelevant, the nationality, color, or language, or religion. The condemnation should be automatically, because the policy of the UN says that this type of practice unacceptable. We need to know how to separate the elements here between the UN itself and the policies that are already in place, and to the member states that may decide not to use the policy, but the employees of the UN, the system, the UN system, what we call it, should be following the resolution and the policies that are already in place. And not say because she's Israel, therefore, we can wait and we can investigate it for months and months and months and months before we have no more excuses, and then we can condemn it. I think things should be otherwise. When there is sufficient evidence, and in this case, we have videos. In this case, we had the Washington Post running independent evaluation, and they decided months and months and months before the UN that there is more than enough evidence to condemn Hamas for his atrocities. But the UN took the time, and I disagree with this part. I'm not saying that always Israel right. I'm not saying always the UN is right. But fair treatment for all. Like we say, the UN, energy for all. I'm coming from infrastructure business. We say energy for all, water for all, public health for all. For all means when you rape Israeli woman, you will stand with her immediately, or right after that you verified, and there is a reasonable reason to believe that whatever we allege to happen has the legal base and the moral base.
And yet here we are, 348 days after the massacre. The evidence is clear. Women were raped, children, people were beheaded, 1,200 people were murdered, 250 people were taken hostage. And yet to this day, there is not a condemnation of Hamas. This is something which seems to be a complete disparity between what should be the moral position of the UN and the reality on the ground.
From my point of view, I think the UN is supposed to be a wonderful organization. Truly, I love the UN. The UN representing the human values that we all want for our family. To go to work, to earn enough money, to support our family with dignity, and to have some little freedom, and to enjoy life. The UN that deals with all those issues that affecting our life, from human rights to public health. I want to be healthy. I need vaccine for COVID. The UN is not the evil organization that some people believe it is. It is not functioning correctly, but as a value organization, it is an enormous organization that should be admired. There are not many organizations on the planet that receives so many Nobel Prizes, like the UN. It is abused and misused, but it is a different subject. Look at the UN as the UN and separate it from the votes. It would help all of us to make better sense of what we see and why resolution can pass, even if the UN Secretary General opposes it. I give you a good example. The resolution of member states to support the US in September 11 passed collectively without any exception. And Kofi Annan came up in his resolution and said it is time for us to address terrorism as a single voice. And the right of people, the right of individual and a state or collective group of people to self-determination, to self-defense, is unequivocally accepted by everybody. However, the same rights, if you watch the news today, the UN is trying to be revoked from Israel by the member states, not by the UN. Now, when UN spin it, it is a different story. And that part should be condemned and corrected. And it's supposed to start immediately. It should be done right. The point about Israel, about the UN, I hope I made it clear. I want to make it clear on Israel. There are systems at the international organization, including the system that I individually required to operate. May I share with you? It would help the audience to understand.
Certainly.
The UN is not operating under local law of New York. Neither the World Bank or the IMF operating under the law of Washington, or Global Bank supposed to operate under the law of California, even if it's located in California. Those organizations, all international organizations operating under treaty, they're operating under international laws, which is basically a treaty-based. They're treaty-based organizations. The organization does not allow you to discriminate against members when they one against another. If you do discriminate against any of the member states, let's say at the IMF, it's the same treaty that's signed among all of them. They are incorporated by decree. So the same agreement, which is the UN Charter, the articles, what we refer to the article in the case of the World Bank or the IMF, signed by all members identically. More so, for the purpose of correction and clarity, we have to recognize how the UN, World Bank, IMF, WTO, and so many other organizations has been formed. I like to say it, the world as we know it, the world as we know it today, it's formed out of America, out of its own vision of itself, not out of the vision of Iraq for itself or Iran for itself. The UN was American idea. The WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Intellectual Property Organization, all of those, many of the ideas are coming from a single country that contributing to the UN out of its own self-image. We don't go against the US and say, hey, you created it, you created this monster, and you are liable. We all under the same treaty, and we all agree to the treaty because we believe it's the right treaty. However, individual states may decide to sign the treaty in cases of human rights, to sign the UN treaty, but not to follow it. So in the cases of China, for example, China might sign all the 13 human rights related treaties, but not necessarily following those rules. They sign treaties with the WTO, with countries, not necessarily they follow the rules. So we need to separate the issues here to be able to figure out where the cancer is. I think it is largely misunderstanding the UN because of its own corporate culture. You are there at the UN to facilitate technical dialogue. If you are at the UN agencies, and if you are the Secretariat, you are there to facilitate political process. Keep your opinion for yourself, because as you are a member of the international community, you are serving all nations, not a single one.
So the record, I have to say, of the UN, at least the General Assembly as regards Israel, is not a particularly complimentary one. Over the last 10 years, over 150 resolutions condemning Israel for having the audacity to survive and to live on and to fight terrorism, and only 80 resolutions regarding the entire rest of the world. That's when you have China carrying out whatever they're doing to the Uyghurs, where you have Bashar Assad in Syria murdering his own population, gassing them to death, acts of terrorism throughout Africa, taking the lives of tens of thousands. And yet there seems to be this obsession with the only Jewish country in the world. That's from the UN General Assembly. When you come to the personnel of the UN, who I understand that you can't make any generalizations, but when you see people like Francesca Albanese, who is just an open anti-Semite, holding a central UN position and really using and promoting her own anti-Semitic views, using the UN platform, and the UN simply being incapable or unwilling, unable to deal with that. Rogue countries do whatever they want, especially those that sit on the Security Council as permanent members, and certain individuals enjoy really carte blanche to expose and expose anti-Semitic views, and nothing is done about it. How can that be a reflection of the UN's charter, of the UN's values, of the UN's desire to promote peace, when one country is the subject of obsession and hatred almost every single day of the year?
Let's correct something. Would help the audience to understand it. When any international organizations, especially the UN, when international organization looking to appoint somebody to high-level position, the international organization, like the UN, will publish a job description. If you would like, I will provide you sample of it, that the organization will ask, we are looking for a candidate, call it public affair, and we are looking for someone, and among many things, you need to speak foreign languages. More than one language would be good if he's speaking French and English. However, also he has to declare human rights issues violation. If this person participating in any activity against any group in terrorist activities, he will fail to obtain at least the temporary security clearance or the permanent security clearance. And when employee of the UN or international organization joining the World Bank, joining the IMF, joining Global Bank, whatever, they need to obtain security clearance. But the security clearance takes time. So the person is supposed to obtain a temporary security clearance to prove that he is a decent global citizen without any background of committing murders, rapes, anti-Semitism. When the nomination of the person to the position starting, they found they will take it to the board. At that point, Israel is powerful, at least the last time I count, it's yesterday. Israel is a very powerful country because Israel has many allies in the realm of what we call it democratic countries. And the most powerful one is the US. The other one is the UK. And the third one is France. And if you take the three, that's permanent member of the United Nations, you should be able to block nominee of every single person to any key position which has an issues with, which we have an issue with. And I'm all in favor of it, to clean the system out, to be sure that Israel using the UN system in the way which the UN or any other organization designed, not ignoring it, not being angry at it, but making a use of systems that are already in place that will block the nominations of people with the wrong background. And as you know, you and I had discussion before, one of the former Secretary General of the United Nations was a Nazi German.
Staying to this day on the UN system.
And the UN should adopt policies to protect their own reputation afterward. There is a system in place to prevent such events, because it's very hard to run away from a negative public opinion. It's hurt.
And yet the UN system doesn't seem to be capable of doing that. If you take just the position of the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council, it seems that they are looking not only for people who are anti-Israel, but every time looking to up their game, from Richard Falk to Michael Link to Francesca Albanese. I think the UN has almost got to the bottom of that black pit, and it seems to be accepting that reality as something which is not only something which they are living with, but it's something which they are actively pursuing, that only certain people from a certain background and bias against Israel can even get to those positions.
Maurice, when October 7 event took place, at that morning, I received many hundreds of messages to my phone, letting me know that event occurred. I was addicted to it. I could not do anything for a few days. It took all my energy, all my mind, and maybe emotions. I was paralyzed. And I began to seek information about the conflict. I am a type of person which is a pro-peace. I want to believe that I can make the world better. And when there is another big event take place at barbaric level that we have seen, it hurts. So I begin to follow the conflict on an hourly basis, and for a long time. That's the way I got to know you, in fact. When I got to follow the conflict and to see, to hear the UN against Israel, Israel against the UN, citizens of Israel talking about it, I found out there is complete detachment from reality. And that's why I'm on your program. Israel can stop if Israel use the system in the way it intended to be used. If you got any bigot or any person that has a background, he should never pass security clearance. And in his contract, it says, at least every single of my people has in their contract. I'm sure all my colleagues the same. They have in the contract says you have the responsibility to obtain and maintain security clearance. And the organization reserves the rights to terminate your contract if you fail to maintain security clearance. Use it. You have three permanent member of the Security Council on day one. It's hard for me to imagine that you can fail in an organization that typically, operationally, I'm using operationally versus the member states. We usually vote. We are seeking usually to get all members of the committees or board to vote together, to pass resolution based on agreement and not based on vote. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear. Not every resolution operational. When we are doing operation, we want to reach consensus on the board that this is what right thing to do. Even if one member oppose it, we will not pass the approval until we got it clear. We got the issues addressed. And in our case, in the case of Israel, Israel does not go into the UN committees or the UN secretary and says, hey, you're hiring the wrong person and I'm here to object to it. And if you make it difficult for me, I will get the permanent member of the Security Council. And usually, you got a few more people on the Security Council, few more countries. I mean, on the Security Council, like Japan, that is friendly audience. And you should be able to use the system as it is to say it's enough. That my observation on this is that Israel saying something like this, I could be wrong, but from my knowledge, what I've seen in the past year, Israel saying, UN makes me so much problems. I don't want to deal with that. So it makes you a military might and a diplomatic dwarf. And this is wrong. You cannot subcontract your diplomacy to another country, to the US. You should not do it. And if you are doing it, you should stop. Right now, deal with the UN in the way the UN is designed to work.
So if we take that forward a few steps, Mr. Nechemia, how do we deal, for example, with the Palestinian Department, with the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, the committee that was set up together with the resolution equating Zionism, the only idea of Jewish self-determination in its ancestral homeland, with racism? That was thankfully a stain on the UN, which was deleted. And yet the committee set up on the same day to then operate that discrimination, that racism against Jews continues to function to this day, spreads the lies about Israel around the world in all the UN languages, and is a source of the worst anti-Semitism against Israel. Really, what Israel's experience in the UN, excuse me, and I don't say this lightly, is very much akin to battered wife syndrome. Every single day we know that we're going to go into the organization, we're going to try and do our best, but every day we're going to end the day battered, bruised, and eventually worse than that, because that's what happens every single day. And that's the mechanism that exists to vilify, undermine, and delegitimize Israel.
Okay, let me give you an example that, from my view, because I've been part of it. At the beginning of the war, if you may remember, was accusation against Israel that Israel dropped a bomb from the warplanes, on a hospital in Gaza. And the numbers at the news, the 800 people. I went online immediately to check what information available. And then I found out that it's a highly disputed event within minutes. But within the time frame, within the first 30 minutes that I have been digging information online on the event, trying to dig information online, I've seen a statement condemning Israel by the current UN Secretary General and the murder of 800 or so Palestinians within 30 minutes. They had no time to investigate it. It was on the shelf, a press release, that was sent to the media. When we look at this event, for example, from my point of view, you're just contributing to the clashes of civilization. Exactly what the UN Secretariat is trying to avoid. You're just contributing to evil, to murder, by making empty statements, by blaming and accusing people. For such event, drew my attention to the conflict and the way the Secretariat is working. In this case, we can say UNRWA, because they are in Gaza. I was very disturbed. In fact, you can read my writing. It's available on the issue. So we can ask each other a question right now. How can something like this can happen? It takes the credibility of the UN Secretary General when he makes such a statement. It's hurting his credibility with the world. But bad news travel faster than good news. And that's what happened here. By the time the world corrected it, it was too late. Here is the point. How this person, the head of communication, got to power. How can she hold it? If you have knowledge of communication, we are dealing with crisis management, a war reporting, not only crisis management. In crisis management, they will teach you to get the fact straight first before you make any statement and going to the news. This is the first part. The second part, which is very important, it is very important not only to you or to Israel, it's very important to the audience and the world to know it. People that working in communication, not corporate, people that working in war reporting or reporting from the war zone, they get training. Then there are procedures how to you report casualties. And those procedures clearly not followed, not on this event, and not a few others following this event, which I investigated because I'm writing on those issues. That means that either you are doing it purposely, could be, or you are incompetent. Which one are you? Because as we say in America, ignorance is not an excuse. If you don't have the appropriate training to be reporting correctly, then the UN should train you. And somebody up there not doing his job or does not care enough about his job. Because if he does care for his job, he will stop it.
And yet, Ocha, to this day, as I said, bullhorns the false numbers of Hamas. The incident you mentioned in the Al Ahli hospital on the 17th of October still appears, even though we know that it was not Israel who attacked the hospital. It was a misfired rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad that killed less than 50 people. And I don't make light of any life lost. But yet on the UN website, there is still the accusation that the attack was carried out by Israel, killing 471 people, that published after it was clear that that was simply a lie.
So I want to bring it to another issue related, okay? Publishing. Let's say that IMF or the World Bank wants to publish an article or a study under not the individual name of employee, because we want to separate freedom of press, freedom of expression from official statement of the IMF or the World Bank or any other international organization. And this time, the opinion is about China, not about Israel, about China. And there are many things to say about this subject. And what you will see is the Chinese ambassador to the organization or the executive director to the organization will go out in the board before the publication of such document will express outrage and says, hey, do you know China better than China? Do you know how much tax we collected? Do you know how many people die in our country from COVID? Oh, I know more because I'm the host country. I'm the country that in discussion, and they will block the possibility of this statement. They will negotiate it. What is Israel doing today? Nothing. You don't do your job. You don't use the system as it is intended to be used. You get angry, you get frustrated, you point a finger, you accuse them, you call them names. You did not block the resolution. You did not block the nominations. It is your problem and should be fixed. The anger does not help. Anger is not a strategy. Revenge is not a strategy. And this is why I'm on your program, because I want it corrected. It benefits humanity. It will benefit all of us if the system is used in the way it is intended. It must be fixed. Walking in Washington, shaking hands with people, changing cards, business cards, and building a nice network is not being a good ambassador to any country. Yes, you can help with business. Those are political appointees that do not understand the UN system or international organization behavior, governance. They don't understand it. So how can misconduct like this can last for 70 years? In my opinion, you disengaged from the UN because you are very angry. It's not supposed to be like that. If you want to appoint, learn from the US. When the US appointing an ambassador to a country because of political affiliation is a politically appointed to any country. The person there to shake hands for formalities, for ceremonial purposes, and right behind them, there are technocrats. That when the person leaves the room or sit quiet, technocrat will take over the discussions. I don't see it in Israel. I think, and I recommend, it start from education. It's starting from the universities in Israel. Speak our language. It's very simple. Teach it. Diplomacy is an art. I don't see, it's very undiplomatic for the ambassador to call the UN Secretary General name and in the public, in global news reported, at the same time, or shortly after to ask for a favor. It's a no-no. It's a no-go. I think it's wrong. It's supposed to be a diplomatic. It's a high-stake game. Let's correct myself. It is not a high-stake game. It is the highest stake game, which we abused.
So I have to say, in my experience, albeit very limited, on the local stage, and I've never been a representative of Israel in the UN in any way, shape, or form, or even close to the closest I got was representing Israel with discussions with UNICEF in 2013-14, and I have to say that my counterparts, colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did, at least in my understanding, express and really demonstrate a high level of both professionalism, knowledge of the workings of the UN, and yet it seems that it doesn't necessarily always come through. But unfortunately, Mr. Nechemia, as much as I would like to continue on with the discussion, our time has come to an end. And so, but what I like to do, even on days like this, when I think the picture is quite bleak, definitely from what is about to unfold in the UN, I like to finish the programs on a positive note. is there a chance for reform of the UN? Or is there just a basic misunderstanding of Israelis? We have this expectation that the UN will be neutral, that it will itself police itself. Is that just a fundamental misunderstanding, or should that be something which the UN itself seeks to promote?
I think there is a lot of room for improvement from my assessment of the situation over the past year. Plenty of room to improve. Wrong is wrong. The UN people tend to be more on the idealistic side. I think I mentioned to you, more on the idealistic side. And you want to work with them according to norms that they would accept. And you cannot get many UN employees to disagree with you that rape is wrong. I don't believe it. I don't think you can get member of the Secretariat to disagree with you. You should be able to galvanize them, to get them on your side when a rape takes place, especially war crimes like that. The system designed in such a way that you should take advantage of it, make good use of it, and improve it, because the UN should be for all, with no exception, regardless of religion, culture, geographic location. It's for all.
Let's just hope that those really noble words and noble goals that should reflect the UN actually play out today, that they don't deny Israel its right to self-defense, its right to defend itself and its citizens against the genocidal terrorists. It doesn't undermine the peace process by really pushing the Palestinians into a corner where they can show no flexibility. Not that they're really willing to show any flexibility anyway, but now we're pushing them further and further into the corner. And really the UN, instead of being the body and the vehicle for diplomacy, seems to be just promoting and strengthening extremism. That I think is a sad position that the UN has got to, really against its noble cause. And I appreciate your assessment and your hope that something positive can change, both from Israel's approach, where we need to make changes, and both on the side of the UN. But for now, Mr. Nechemia, again, thank you very, very much for joining us. For our audience, thank you for joining us too. We will be back with you again next week. And we hope to continue to be able to bring you really the top analysis and the top experts discussing the subjects which are relevant for every day that we go along through the conflict, a task which isn't always the easiest thing to do. But really thank you to all of our really devoted followers. Again, Mr. Nechemia, I reserve the right, if I may, and as you have already suggested, to invite you back onto the War Room and to other podcasts of the JCFA to really discuss how we can implement these changes, make the necessary movements within all of the systems to really create that better world that we're looking for, on the one hand, and also to maybe pick your brain a little bit on the idea of aid and aid development, really your expertise subject, also regarding the manner in which the international community funds the Palestinian Authority. But for today, unfortunately, that is it. Have a good weekend, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, and stay safe.
Thank you very much.